Hello, 7th grade. Today we are going to be reading from Robinson Crusoe. So I want to tell you a little bit about the author. Just listen, this is not in your book. Author information. Born of a middle-class family in London, Daniel Defoe, 1660 to 1731, grew up to become a well-known novelist and journalist. He wrote on political and religious subjects for newspapers, published pamphlets, and even began his own newspaper. Defoe appealed to the middle class because he was one of the first writers to describe ordinary people in a realistic manner. His Robinson Crusoe, published in 1719, was one of the first English novels, and it remains one of the most popular adventure stories in the world. Here's a brief introduction before we get started. Shortly after Robinson Crusoe ran away from home to become a sailor, he was taken captive and sold into slavery. He was rescued several years later, but the ship that rescued him was wrecked and he alone survived. In this selection from Robinson Crusoe, we read about how Crusoe settles into his new life on an uninhabited island. Although this adaptation of Robinson Crusoe uses modern spelling, the original language has been left intact as much as possible. Summaries have been used to supply necessary details from parts of the story that have been omitted. So open your books to page 43, and we're reading from Robinson Crusoe. Our objectives today are to identify Daniel Defoe as an author to know, to summarize the events of the story, and to describe how Crusoe lived on the island. In the tan box at the top of page 43, it says, Robinson Crusoe survives a shipwreck only to find himself stranded on a desolate island. For protection, he sleeps in a tree during his first night on the island. The next morning, he wakes up to an urgent need to find food and permanent shelter. Here we go. When I waked, it was broad day, the weather clear and the storm abated, so that the sea did not rage and swell as before. But that which surprised me most was that the ship was lifted off in the night from the sand where she lay, by the swelling of the tide, and was driven up almost as far as the rock which I first mentioned, where I had been so bruised by the dashing of me against it. This being within about a mile from the shore where I was, and the ship seeming to stand upright still, I wished myself on board that, at least, I might save some necessary things for my use. When I came down from my apartment in the tree, I looked about me again, and the first thing I found was the boat, which lay as the wind and the sea had tossed her up upon the land, about 2 miles on my right hand. I walked as far as I could upon the shore to have got to her, but found a neck or inlet of water between me and the boat, which was about 1/2 mile broad. So I came back for the present, being more intent upon getting at the ship, where I hoped to find something for my present subsistence. A little after noon, I found the sea very calm and the tide ebbed so far out that I could come within 1/4 mile of the ship. And here I found a fresh renewing of my grief, for I saw evidently that if we had kept on board, we had all been safe, that is to say, we had all got safe on shore, and I had not been so miserable as to be left entirely destitute of all comfort and company as I now was. This forced tears from my eyes again, but as there was little relief in that, I resolved, if possible, to get to the ship. So I pulled off my clothes, for the weather was hot to extremity, and took to the water. But when I came to the ship, my difficulty was still greater to know how to get on board, for as she lay aground and high out of the water, there was nothing within my reach to lay hold of. I swam round her twice, and the second time I spied a small piece of rope, which I wondered I did not see at first, hang down by the forechains, so low that with great difficulty I got hold of it, and by the help of that rope got up to the forecastle of the ship. Here I found that the ship was bulged, and had a great deal of water in her hold, but that she lay so on the side of a bank of hard sand, or rather earth, that her stern lay lifted up upon the bank, and her head low almost to the water. By this means all her quarter was free, and all that was in that part was dry. For you may be sure my first work was to search and to see what was spoiled and what was free. And first I found that all the ship's provisions were dry and untouched by the water, and being very well disposed to eat, I went to the bread room and filled my pockets with biscuit, and ate it as I went about other things, for I had no time to lose. Now I wanted nothing but a boat to furnish myself with many things which I foresaw would be very necessary to me. It was in vain to sit still and wish for what was not to be had, and this extremity roused my application. We had several spare yards, and 2 or 3 large spars of wood, and a spare topmast or 2 in the ship. I resolved to fall to work with these, and I flung as many of them overboard as I could manage for their weight, tying every one with the rope that they might not drive away. When this was done, I went down to the ship's side and pulled them to me. I tied 4 of them fast together at both ends as well as I could in the form of a raft, and laying 2 or 3 short pieces of plank upon them crossways, I found I could walk upon it very well, but that it was not able to bear any great weight, the pieces being too light. So I went to work, and with the carpenter's saw, I cut a spare topmast into 3 lengths and added them to my raft with a great deal of labor and pains. But hope of furnishing myself with necessaries encouraged me to go beyond what I should have been able to have done upon another occasion. My raft was now strong enough to bear any reasonable weight. My next care was what to load it with, and how to preserve what I laid upon it from the surf of the sea. But I was not long considering this. I first laid all the plank or boards upon it that I could get, and having considered well what I wanted most, I first got 3 of the seamen's chests, which I had broken open and emptied, and lowered them down upon my raft. The first of these I filled with provisions, namely bread, rice, 3 Dutch cheeses, 5 pieces of dried goat's flesh, which we lived much upon, and a little remainder of European corn, which had been laid by for some fowls which we brought to sea with us, but the fowls were killed. There had been some barley and wheat together, but to my great disappointment, I found afterwards that the rats had eaten or spoiled it all. While I was loading the raft, I found the tide began to flow, although very calm, and I had the mortification to see my coat, shirt, and waistcoat, which I had left on shore upon the sand, swim away. As for my breeches, which were only linen and open-kneed, I swam on board in them, and my stockings. However, this put me upon rummaging for clothes, of which I found enough, but took no more than I wanted for present use, for I had other things which my eye was more upon. First, tools to work with on shore. And it was long after searching that I found out the carpenter's chest, which was indeed a very useful prize to me, and was much more valuable than a shiploading of gold would have been at the time. I got it down to my raft, even whole as it was, without losing time to look into it, for I knew in general what it contained. My next care was for some ammunition and arms. There were 2 very good fowling pieces in the great cabin, and 2 pistols. These I secured first with some powder horns, and a small bag of shot, and 2 old rusty swords. I knew that there were 3 barrels of powder in the ship, but I knew not where our gunner had stowed them. But with much search I found them, 2 of them dry and good. The 3rd had taken water. Those 2 I got to my raft with the arms, and now I thought to myself pretty well freighted, and began to think how I should get to shore with them, having neither sail or rudder, and the least capful of wind would have overset all my navigation. I had 3 encouragements: a smooth, calm sea, the tide rising and setting to the shore, and what little wind there was blew me toward the land. And thus, having found 2 or 3 broken oars belonging to the boat, and besides the tools which were in the chest, I found 2 saws, an axe, and a hammer. And with this cargo, I put to sea. For a mile or thereabouts, my raft went very well, only that I found it drive a little distant from the place where I had landed before, by which I perceived that here was some indraft of the water, and consequently I hoped to find some creek or river there, which I might make use of as a port to get to land with my cargo. Crusoe found a creek that he could use as a port, and after nearly capsizing his raft, he managed to bring the raft into a cove and there moor it. My next work was to view the country and seek a proper place for my habitation, and where to stow my goods to secure them from whatever might happen. Where I was, I yet knew not, whether on the continent or on an island, whether inhabited or not inhabited, whether in danger of wild beasts or not. There was a hill not a mile from me, which rose up very steep and high, and which seemed to overtop some other hills, which lay as in a ridge from it northward. I took out one of the fowling pieces, and one of the pistols, and a horn of powder, and thus armed I traveled for discovery up to the top of that hill, where after I had with great labor and difficulty got to the top, I saw my fate to my great affliction, namely, that I was on an island environed every way with sea, no land to be seen, except some rocks which lay a great way off, and 2 small islands less than this, which lay about 3 leagues to the west. I found also that the island I was on was uninhabited, except by wild beasts, of whom, however, I saw none. Yet I saw an abundance of fowls, but knew not their kinds. Neither when I killed them could I tell what was fit for food and what not. At my coming back, I shot at a great bird, which I saw sitting upon a tree on the side of a great wood. I believe it was the first gun that had been fired there since the creation of the world. I had no sooner fired, but from all the parts of the wood there arose an innumerable number of fowls of many sorts, making a confused screaming and crying, every one according to his usual note, but not one of them any kind that I knew. As for the creature I killed, I took it to be a kind of hawk, its color and beak resembling it, but it had no talons or claws more than common. Its flesh was fit for nothing. Contented with this discovery, I came back to my raft and fell to work to bring my cargo on shore, which took me up the rest of that day. And what to do with myself at night I knew not, nor indeed where to rest. I was afraid to lie down on the ground, not knowing but some wild beast might devour me, although, as I afterwards found, there was really no need for those fears. However, as well as I could, I barricaded myself round with the chests and boards that I had brought on shore, and made a kind of hut for that night's lodging. As for food, I yet saw not which way to supply myself, except that I had seen 2 or 3 creatures like hares run out of the woods where I shot the fowl. In the following days, Robinson Crusoe made more trips to the ship in order to bring provisions back to the island. He found many useful items, including nails, tools, a grindstone, bullets, muskets, clothing, and bedding. I had been now 13 days on shore, and had been 11 times on board the ship, in which time I had brought away all that one pair of hands could well be supposed capable to bring, although I believed verily, had the calm weather held, I should have brought away the whole ship piece by piece. But preparing the 12th time to go on board, I found the wind began to rise. However, at low water, I went on board, and although I thought I had rummaged the cabin so effectually as that nothing more could be found, yet I discovered a locker with drawers in it, in one of which I found about 36 pounds value in money, some European coin, some Brazil, some pieces of 8, some gold, some silver. I smiled to myself at the sight of this money. "O drug," I said aloud, "what art thou good for? Thou art not worth to me. No, not the taking off of the ground. One of those knives is worth all this heap. I have no manner of use for thee. Even remain where thou art, and go to the bottom as a creature whose life is not worth saving." However, upon second thoughts, I took it away, and wrapping all this in a piece of canvas, I began to think of making another raft. But while I was preparing this, I found the sky overcast, and the wind began to rise, and in a quarter of an hour it blew a fresh gale from the shore. It presently occurred to me that it was in vain to pretend to make a raft with the wind offshore, and that it was my business to be gone before the tide of the flood began. Otherwise, I might not be able to reach the shore at all. Accordingly, I let myself down into the water and swam across the channel, which lay between the ship and the sands, and even that with difficulty enough, partly with the weight of the things I had about me, and partly the roughness of the water, for the wind rose very hastily, and before it was quite high water, it blew a storm. But I was gotten home to my little tent, where I lay with all my wealth about me very secure. It blew very hard all that night, and in the morning when I looked out, behold, no more ship was to be seen. I was a little surprised, but recovered myself with this satisfactory reflection, namely, that I had lost no time, nor abated no diligence to get everything out of her that could be useful to me, and that indeed there was little left in her that I was able to bring away if I had more time. I now gave over any more thoughts of the ship, or of anything out of her, except what might drive on shore from her wreck, as indeed divers pieces of her afterwards did, but those things were of small use to me. My thoughts were now wholly employed about securing myself against either savages, if any should appear, or wild beasts, if any were on the island. I had many thoughts of the method of how to do this, and what kind of dwelling to make, whether I should make me a cave in the earth, or a tent upon the earth. In short, I resolved upon both, the manner and description in which it may not be improper to give an account of. I soon found the place I was in was not for my settlement, particularly because it was upon a low moorish ground near the sea, and I believed would not be wholesome, and more particularly because there was no fresh water near it. So I resolved to find a more healthy and more convenient spot of ground. I consulted several things in my situation which I found would be proper for me. First, health, and fresh water I just now mentioned. Second, shelter from the heat of the sun. Third, security from ravenous creatures, whether men or beasts. And fourth, a view to the sea, that if God sent any ship in sight, I might not lose any advantage for my deliverance, of which I was not willing to banish all my expectation yet. In search of a place proper for this, I found a little plain on the side of the rising hill, whose front toward this little plain was steep as a house side, so that nothing could come down upon me from the top. On the side of this rock there was a hollow place worn a little way in, like the entrance or door of a cave. But there was not really any cave or way into the rock at all. On the flat of the green, just before this hollow place, I resolved to pitch my tent. This plain was not above 100 yards broad, and about twice as long, and lay like a green before my door, and at the end of it descended irregularly every way down into the low grounds by the seaside. Page 47. It was on the NNW, maybe that's northwest, I don't know, side of the hill, so that I was sheltered from the heat every day, till it came to a W by S sun, maybe west by south, or thereabouts, which in those countries is near the setting. Before I set up my tent, I drew a half circle before the hollow place, which took about 10 yards in its semi-diameter from the rock and 20 yards in its diameter from its beginning and ending. In this half circle, I pitched 2 rows of strong stakes, driving them into the ground till they stood very firm like piles, the biggest end being out of the ground about 5.5 feet, and sharpened on top. The 2 rows did not stand above 6 inches from one another. Then I took the pieces of cable which I had cut in the ship and laid them in rows one upon another within the circle between these 2 rows of stakes up to the top, placing other stakes in the inside, leaning against them about 2.5 feet high, like a spur to post. And this fence was so strong that neither man nor beast could get into it or over it. This cost me a great deal of time and labor, especially to cut the piles in the woods, bring them to the place, and drive them into the earth. The entrance into this place I made to be not by a door, but by a short ladder to go over the top, which ladder, when all was in, I lifted over after me, and so I was completely fenced in, and fortified, as I thought, from all the world, and consequently slept secure in the night, which otherwise I could not have done, although, as it appeared afterward, there was no need of all this caution from the enemies that I apprehended danger from. Into this fence or fortress, with infinite labor, I carried all my riches, all my provisions, ammunition, and stores, of which you have the account above. And I made me a large tent, which, to preserve me from the rains that in one part of the year are very violent there, I made double, namely 1 smaller tent within, and 1 larger tent above it, and covered the uppermost with a large tarpaulin, which I had saved among the sails. Tarpaulin is the long version of a tarp. And now I lay no more for a while in the bed which I had brought on shore, but in a hammock which was indeed a very good one, and belonged to the mate of the ship. Into this tent I brought all my provisions, and everything that would spoil by the wet, and having thus enclosed all my goods, I made up the entrance, which till now I had left open, and so passed and repassed, as I said, by a short ladder. When I had done this, I began to work my way into the rock, and bringing all the earth and stones that I dug down and out through my tent, I laid them up within my fence in the nature of a terrace, that so it raised the ground within about 1.5 feet, And thus I made me a cave just behind my tent, which served me like a cellar to my house. It cost me much labor and many days before all these things were brought to perfection. And therefore I must go back to some other things which took up some of my thoughts. At the same time it happened, after I had laid my scheme for the setting up my tent and making this cave, that a storm of rain falling from a thick dark cloud, a sudden flash of lightning happened, and after that a great clap of thunder, as is naturally the effect of it. I was not so much surprised with the lightning as I was with the thought which darted into my mind as swift as the lightning itself. Oh, my powder! My very heart sunk within me when I thought that at one blast all my powder might be destroyed, on which, not my defense only, but the providing me food, as I thought, entirely depended. I was nothing near so anxious about my own danger, although had the powder took fire, I had never known what had hurt me. Such impression did this make upon me that after the storm was over, I laid aside all my works, my building and fortifying, and applied myself to make bags and boxes to separate the powder, and keep it a little and a little in a parcel, in hopes that whatever might come, it might not take all fire at once, and to keep it so apart that it should not be possible to make one part fire another. I finished this work in about a fortnight, and I think my powder, which in all was about 240 pounds weight, was divided in not less than 100 parcels. As to the barrel that had been wet, I did not apprehend any danger from that, so I placed it in my new cave, which in my fancy I called my kitchen, and the rest I hid up and down in holes among the rocks, so that no wet might come to it, marking very carefully where I had laid it. In the interval of time while this was doing, I went out once at least every day with my gun, as well to divert myself as to see if I could kill anything fit for food, and as near as I could to acquaint myself with what the island produced. The first time I went out, I presently discovered that there were goats on the island, which was a great satisfaction to me. But then it was attended with this misfortune to me, namely, that they were so shy, so subtile, and so swift of foot, that it was the most difficult thing in the world to come at them. But I was not discouraged at this, not doubting that I might now and then shoot one, as it soon happened, for after I had found their haunts a little, I laid wait in this manner for them. I observed if they saw me in the valleys, although they were upon the rocks, they would run away as in a terrible fright. But if they were feeding in the valleys, and I was upon the rocks, they took no notice of me. Whence I concluded that by the position of their optics, their sight was so directed downward that they did not readily see objects that were above them. So afterwards, I took this method. I always climbed the rocks first to get above them, and then had frequently a fair mark. The first shot I made among these creatures, I killed a she-goat, which had a little kid by her which she gave suck to, which grieved me heartily. But when the old one fell, the kid still by her till I came and took her up. And not only so, but when I carried the old one with me upon my shoulders, the kid followed me quite to my enclosure, upon which I laid down the dam, and took the kid into my arms, and carried it over to my pail, in hopes to have bred it up tame. But it would not eat, so I was forced to kill it and eat it myself. These two supplied me with flesh a great while, for I ate sparingly and saved my provisions, my bread especially, as much as possibly as I could. Having now fixed my habitation, I found it absolutely necessary to provide a place to make a fire in and fuel to burn. And what I did for that, as also how I enlarged my cave, and what conveniences I made, I shall give a full account of in its place. But I must first give some little account of myself, and of my thoughts about living, which it may well be supposed were not a few. Crusoe then began to consider his condition. The thought that he was on an uninhabited island well out of the normal course of ships distressed him, and he began to question why Providence had placed him in so miserable a condition. Almost as soon as he complained of his misery, he realized that God had saved him alone of all the men on the ship, and had provided the means to sustain him for as long as he might live on the island. I now began to consider seriously my condition, and the circumstance I was reduced to, and I drew up the state of my affairs in writing, not so much to leave them to any that were to come after me, For I was like to have but few airs, as to deliver my thoughts from daily pouring upon them and afflicting my mind. And as my reason began now to master my despondency, I began to comfort myself as well as I could, and to set the good against the evil, that I might have something to distinguish my case from worse. And I stated it very impartially, like a debtor and creditor, the comforts I enjoyed against the miseries I suffered thus. Page 49. Upon the whole, here was an undoubted testimony that there was scarce any condition in the world so miserable. But there was something negative or something positive to be thankful for in it. And let this stand as a direction from the experience of the most miserable of all conditions in this world, that we may always find in it something to comfort ourselves from, and to set in the description of good and evil on the credit side of the account. See, so he has his little chart with the evil and the good, the pros and the cons. Having now brought my mind a little to relish my condition, and given over looking out to see if I could spy a ship, I say, giving over these things, I began to apply myself to accommodate my way of living, and to make things as easy to me as I could. I have already described my habitation, which was a tent under the side of a rock, surrounded with a strong pale of posts and cables. But I might now rather call it a wall, for I raised a kind of wall up against it of turfs, about 2 foot thick on the outside. And after some time, I think it was a year and a half, I raised rafters from it leaning to the rock, and thatched or covered it with boughs of trees, and such things I could get to keep out of the rain, which I found at some times of the year very violent. I have already observed how I brought all my goods into this pail and into the cave which I had made behind me. But I must observe too, that at first this was a confused heap of goods, which as they lay in no order, so they took up all my place. I had no room to turn myself, so I set myself to enlarge my cave and works farther into the earth. It was a loose sandy rock, which yielded easily to the labor I bestowed on it. So when I found I was pretty safe as to the beast of prey, I worked sideways to the right hand and to the rock, and then turning to the right again, worked quite out and made me a door to come out, on the outside of my pale or fortification. This gave me not only egress and regress, as it were a back way to my tent and to my storehouse, but it gave me room to stow my goods. Page 50. And now I began to apply myself to make such necessary things as I found I most wanted, as particularly a chair and a table, for without these I was not able to enjoy the few comforts I had in the world. I could not write or eat or do several things with so much pleasure without a table. So I went to work, and here I must needs observe that as reason is the substance and original of the mathematics, so by stating and squaring everything by reason, and by making the most rational judgment of things, every man may be in time master of every mechanic art. I had never handled a tool in my life, and yet in time by labor, application, and contrivance, I found at last that I wanted nothing but I could have made it, especially if I had tools. However, I made an abundance of things, even without tools, and some with no more tools than an adze and a hatchet, which perhaps were never made that way before, and that were with infinite labor. For example, if I wanted a board, I had no other way but to cut down a tree, set it on edge before me, and hew it flat on either side with my axe, till I had brought it to be thin as a plank, and then dub it smooth with my adze. It is true, by this method, I could make but one board out of a whole tree, but this I had no remedy for but patience, any more than I had for the prodigious deal of time and labor which it took me up to make a plank or a board. But my time or labor was little worth, and so it was as well employed one way as another. However, I made me a table and a chair, as I observed above in the first place, and this I did out of the short pieces of boards that I had brought on my raft from the ship. When I had wrought out some boards as above, I made large shelves of the breadth of 1.5 feet over another all along one side of my cave to lay all my tools, nails, and ironwork, and in a word, to separate everything at large in their places, that I must come easily to them. I knocked pieces into the wall of the rock to hang up my guns and all the things that would hang up. so that had my cave been seen, it looked like a general magazine of all necessary things, and I had everything so ready at my hand that it was a great pleasure to me to see all my goods in such order, and especially to find my stock of all necessaries so great. Now take out a sheet of paper and complete the Think It Through questions numbers 1 through 6 on page 50. See you in class.